Hello, everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. This week, we're doing our end of the season episode called Lessons Learned from Kamigawa. This is the episode where, just like Limited Resources, Sunset Show, and Lords Unlimited's 50 Takes, we take a look back, a little bit of retrospective at the set, and the way that I like to approach it here on Limited Level Ups is kind of just extract any lessons, any teachings. I believe that every set, every format has something to teach you, whether it be, about, for example, in this set, mana bases, or how to navigate your seat in future formats, or just like card evaluation. There's always some little thing you can pluck out and extract, and we're going to try to do that today. As always, for everybody watching here on Twitch, save your comments to the end, but I will be slightly more interested or, open to interacting with the chat. I think this is always a bit more of a laid-back episode, a little bit more communal. So feel free to interact, and I will try to read your comments if I deem them not nonsense. For anything else, we'll do the normal end of episode kind of Q&A, and yeah, let's just jump in. Anyways, just before we jump in, of course, got to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the number one place that you can go if you want to support the show. If you want to support any of my content, it's the best place you can go. There's a bunch of reward tiers over there, ranging from coaching to Discord benefits to deck tech and deck log review benefits. Go check it out. There's some pretty substantial rewards, I would say, honestly, for the contribution price. So I would encourage you, if you like any of the stuff we're doing here, if you feel like the drafts or these episodes have helped you win a few more drafts, get you a few more packs, a few more gems, all that kind of stuff, go check it out. As always, I also want to shout out the Discord, command Discord in the chat currently. If you want to join a great limited community, I do. If I do say so for myself, I think it is one of the best limited communities out there, and it's free. It's not a gated community. Anybody can join, and yeah, go check that out. One more little shout out, one more little plug. I do want to say that if you are in for more draft content, I do have a bunch of draft videos on YouTube, on the Limited Level Ups YouTube that I started posting. We're starting to grow that, starting to get some substantial traction over there. I'm trying to post about 3 draft videos a week. Sometimes it's going to be more with the new set coming out, new Capenna coming out in, a few weeks. So look forward to that if you're looking for some YouTube draft content, especially if you're not really a Twitch person. I know there's a great divide between Twitch people and YouTube people. So if you are a YouTube person, that is just another way you can go about looking for some content. Anyways, let's jump in. So today, for this Sunset Show, or this I can't use limited resources verbiage. I have to use my own verbiage. For our Lessons Learned show, I have 3 main categories here. So the first one is big picture takeaways, just kind of from how I see the set, my own takeaways, some takeaways I've seen the members of the community kind of takeaway as a whole. I've also secondarily got a community takeaway little section where I reached out to Twitter members and Discord, or I put something on Discord and Twitter being like, hey, what have you learned from this set? A bunch of people responded, and I took a few of them that I want to talk about. So we'll get a little bit of some words from the community. Lastly, we do a little bit of a set re-review, or a revisiting the set review, revisiting some tricky cards that at the beginning of the format, we kind of misevaluated as a community, maybe cards that I misevaluated as a content creator, or thought, had a bit of a skewed view on going in. And it's funny, for this set, I actually think me and Ethan missed the most cards out of any set review I think we've done. Maybe that's not true, but at least in the past year or two, I think Kamigawa is the set we missed the most on going into the set during our set review. So it was really interesting to kind of look back and see where we faltered and why we faltered a little bit. Okay, so big picture takeaways. And of course, I want to focus on takeaways that I think we can bring into other sets, right? It's not just going to be, this is, here's how you draft the green-white enchantment deck. I mean, there's some little takeaways here and there, right? That you can be like, oh, well, if we see enchantments in the future, or if we see, sets that really want you to draft in a very linear way, you can take away the lessons you learned from Kamigawa. But my goal here, I think, is to have some widely applicable takeaways here. So the first one, I think, is the most widely applicable takeaway is Kamigawa really made you focus on multicolor mana bases, right? It made you think about, hey, how am I drafting my 3-color, 4-color, 5-color decks sometimes? And that's, of course, a function of the fixing available. We just had more fixing than we usually do. We had not only lands, or not only a whole cycle of dual lands, but Uncharted Haven as the 5-color land. We had Terrarium, we had Network Terminal, we had some other stuff in there, Grafted Growth, Greater Tanuki. There was a lot of ways to fix your lands, a lot of ways to fix your mana, And because of that, that just leads you to going into 3-4 color spaces a lot of the time. This is especially relevant because, spoiler for anybody who has not seen the spoilers for the next set in New Capenna is a multicolor set. It's a 3-color set. So I think a lot of the stuff that we have, or hopefully you picked up during Kamigawa, we can apply to the next set going forward. That goes from exactly what it means to be multicolor. Are you going to be 2 colors with a splash? Are you going to be full on 3 colors? That goes for a math sound mana base, or a mathematically sound mana base, where your sources actually make sense and you're not just like, well, I guess I should shove in 5 planes and that probably works, right? You're actually using the Frank Karsten kind of method, the calculator. I'm saying calculator as if that's some sort of mythical weird device, but you're using some sort of logic and reasoning, not just putting in a bunch of basics or a bunch of fixing without actually counting your sources. I think that Kamigawa really pushed people to think about that a little more, because there's so many drafts in this format where you ended up there. At least, maybe some people didn't. Maybe some people stuck to 2 colors. But if you were somebody who pushed into that space, you probably had to stop and think once in a while, hey, how am I actually going to build this mana base appropriately so it actually helps me cast my cards? I think a big picture takeaway point from this set, I just noted all of the different kinds of fixers, with the lands, the network terminals and grafted growths, the greater Tanukis, is there's a divide between good fixing and mediocre fixing in Kamigawa. And I assume going forward into future multicolor sets, especially Streets in New Capenna, there's also going to be a similar divide between good and mediocre fixing. And it's up to you to kind of understand what that divide is, or what the tiers of fixing are. From a baseline, or at least for my perspective, the lands are always the top of the heap. These are the best fixers. Now, you could argue that if you're drafting 4 or 5 colors, something like Network Terminal or Grafted Growth can compete, because they fix for 5 colors, not just lock you into 2 or 1 if you have Uncharted Haven. But for how unintrusive they are to your deck, right? You don't have to spend mana to fix. You don't have to take up a spell slot. They are the cream of the crop. And that's mostly true for all sets that I've played, at least, that have a multicolor theme. Where if you want to be drafting a multicolor deck, and especially if you are somebody who is predisposed to drafting a multicolor deck, these are going to be high picks for you. The next tier of fixing is often like the 3 mana, Network Terminal, Grafted Growth, fix for any color kind of style fixing. These are a bit worse because you have to take turn 3 off, right? So that means that you need to make sure your deck has a bunch of 1s and 2s, defensive 1s and 2s, so you don't just die on an early turn before you get your feet under you. But the upside of these, like I was saying, is that they do fix you for multiple colors. It's funny, I just before this podcast had a draft on stream where the draft was really going haywire, honestly. We ended up in 5 colors. It ended up being a really good deck with some powerful stuff, but it's held together by a bunch of Grafted Growths and Network Terminals, right? Again, pushing into more than 3 colors, these are probably at least equivalent fixers to the lands. The third category, when you push into the mediocre fixing, your Greater Tanukis, your Ecologist Terrariums, here's where you're getting to kind of Clunk City, where they generally only fix you for 1 color at a time. You can't go get, blue and green off of your Ecologist Terrarium. And, well, I mean, you can go blue or green, but not blue and green like you could with the Grafted Growth. And they're expensive. They don't affect the board. These are the kind of fixers I think you want to try to stay away from. Or at least, worst case scenario fixers. Kind of the scraping up some good fixing from the draft when you don't actually get the best of the best one. I think it's important going into New Capenna or any other future multicolor set to differentiate these, right, in your mind. Because not all fixing is created equally. And it's easy to be like, oh, look, I had all the fixing that, was required if you're just doing the math for I need 3 sources for my splash or 4 sources for 2 cards or whatever. It's easy to go, oh, look, I had the sources. Why didn't this deck work that well? Well, it might be because that your fixing was a bit clunkier than you would have liked. And you didn't pick up the lands. You picked up the secondary fixing. Another big thing I want to point out with mana bases is it's good to know your tendencies and draft accordingly, right? If you watch somebody like Sam Black or Kenji draft, there are people that are going to be taking those Network Terminals and those Grafted Growths pretty highly, higher than I would, higher than, a lot of other streamers I've seen, because their tendencies lead them towards, multicolor good stuff. They know that they excel with those kind of decks. They know that they have fun drafting those kind of decks. And so it's kind of okay for them to be taking that kind of fixing, first, second, third pick in a weakish pack. I think that for other drafters, it's probably not right for them to do that. It's probably right for them to fall into the multicolor decks when a streamlined 2-color deck is not apparent. And jumping forward a little bit to New Capenna, it's not going to be straight 3-color decks, I'm assuming. The little hints and sprinkles we've seen so far. You're often going to be 2 colors in a splash, or 2 colors in a light splash, 2 colors in a heavy splash, maybe 2 colors and 2 splashes. I would also assume, based on how the infrastructure of previous multicolor sets has played out, there is going to be room for 2-color decks. So while fixing is going to be a priority if you're somebody who wants to or finds themselves in these 3-color decks a lot of the time, you could also still be somebody who first picks a Moon Circuit Hacker or a Network Disruptor, right? Just a more streamlined card, more streamlined 2-color card that isn't necessarily contingent on you picking up all the awesome cards of a bunch of different colors. I think that if you looked at the 17 land stats of Grafted Growth or Network Terminal, they point towards cards that you shouldn't pick early, right? You shouldn't pick as high picks. But I do think that, again, if you find yourself excelling in these decks or find yourself enjoying them, honestly, if these are good, drafts or decks that you like to draft, it's totally fine to bump those up in your priority. If you know that, hey, I'm going to end up with a bunch of colors anyways, I should probably have some places or some ways to cast those cards. Another thing that Kamigawa taught us, or at least brought to the forefront of people's minds, is the tension between power and consistency. And I think this really bore itself out in the cycle of color cards, the Invoke the Ancient, Invoke the Winds, those kind of cards, where you could have these multicolor decks that really had not that tough of a time casting these cards, even if they weren't 12 forest decks casting Invoke the Ancients. You could be a 9 forest or an 8 forest deck with a bunch of fixing, and you would still be able to get there because you had a bunch of multicolor fixers. But there were also times where you're like, well, I'm in this kind of multicolor space. I have the capacity to cast some off-color cards, but how comfortably and easily do I think it's going to be to cast these color cards? And you really had to ask yourself, what is the trade-off I'm making between consistency and power? And I think that's just like a very common question you're going to be asking yourself at any multicolor set. It's going to be, how likely is it that I can reap the rewards of putting all these multicolor cards in your deck? Especially something like a Farewell, right? Just like a 4 white card, which is one of the best cards in the set. It's kind of funny. Kamigawa was one of the sets that had very few best of the best cards being double pipped. A lot of them were single pipped, like the Kikichiki Saga, the Jugen Saga, Inventive Iteration. So a lot of the times it's like, ooh, I want to take this awesome card and I want to try to play it. Oh, whoops, it's a double colored card. You didn't have that problem so much in this set. It was really for Farewell is the one that really comes to mind as, you're drafting blue-green and you see a Farewell pack 2 and you're like, all right, well, let's see if we can cast this. And I think, conventional wisdom says don't cast or don't try to put double color cards in your deck as a splash card, right? It's very hard to do. But when the fixing is prevalent enough, you can do it. I think don't splash double color cards is a good piece of advice especially for beginners, right? That's mostly predicated on the idea that it's very, very hard to get enough sources into your deck to cast the double colored card. But as we know, in a set with a lot of fixing, yeah, sure, you can have a mana base that casts your blue and green cards, and then you have 6 multicolored fixers, and Farewell will be a reasonable castable card. So I would just say going forward, really ask yourself, if you're going to shove a really powerful card in your deck, be honest with yourself, right? Be honest and say, hey, can I actually cast this multicolor or this dual pipped card or this quad pipped card? Sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's responsible to do so and worth doing so because the payoff is really, really good. But also, just temper yourself and know that if you're taking that risk, sometimes you are going to, shoot yourself in the foot a little bit. Looking forward, as again, a little bit of a step into New Capenna. So I touched on this before, but I do want to reiterate, and I'm going to be talking about this more in coming weeks. I think when you hear multicolor set, it's very easy to, I did this when, going back to Khans of Tarkir, which was a set from, 10 years ago now? No, 8 years ago, 2014. It was one of my first draft sets, and in the tagline, or kind of the headliner thing about the set was, it's 3 colors, right? It was wedges instead of shards. This set is shards, that set was wedges. I remember my first, 20, 30 drafts, I was just building these horrendous mana bases, absolutely, truly atrocious. Like, I look back on them today, and I, just want to give myself a little slap in the face. The thing about multicolor sets is, even though there is a lot of good fixing at common often, it's hard to have enough fixing to be straight 3 colors, right? Straight black, red, blue. It's very hard for that to be still a functional mana base. So often what's going to happen, like I was saying, is your 2 colors and a heavy splash, right? In this set, you're like red and green, heavy white splash. And then sometimes you're just going down a 2-color path where you're like, I'm just red and green, and I pick up like 1 color, one other card of another color, 1 white card. And that's fine too. With all the stuff I was saying about, weighing power versus consistency, that's going to be very prevalent or very at the forefront of how you're building your mana base in this coming set, because you're not always going to be those 3-color decks, and you're not always going to be a 2-color deck. Sometimes you are going to be a 5-color deck. Another big takeaway, I think, for Kamigawa is there is a big range between 2-color and 5-color. Sometimes you are way off the deep end 5-color, and sometimes you're just a little bit of... Don't go into this coming set saying, hey, this is a multicolor set, I'm going to be drafting red card, green card, white card, red card, green card, white card. Really still go in expecting to build a functional mana base is what I would say. All right, next big picture point. Put faith in the headliner mechanics, but be critical of the auxiliary ones. So I am a big believer, something I say a lot is put faith in what Wizards is doing from a design perspective. Put faith in the fact that they've tested these sets, the mechanics work, they're not going to be flops, even though if they look a little bit strange. It's I have some faith in the good people over there at Wizards of the Coast. Now, as I have played more and more and more in sets, just from a design perspective, the main takeaway is that you can put a little bit of faith in the headliner mechanic for this set. For example, it was Sagas. I know a lot of people are very hesitant about, are these too slow or they're even going to be good? And I was optimistic going in, and they ended up being quite good, as we know. And if you look back, I think the one exception might be Werewolves or maybe Venture in Midnight Hunt. They had a little bit of faltering there, for sure. Venture was not exactly the best mechanic, and Werewolves, well, I would argue they didn't actually do anything to make Werewolves stand out. It was just like any other archetype, so that one actually kind of gets a pass. It just happened to be unfortunate that the set was named after Werewolves, and Green Red was a really bad color pair. But if you go back, I do think, if you look at Lesson Learned, right, and you go past that, go to Call of Time's Land Mechanics, Snow, go past that, go to the MDFCs and Zendikar, I do think they do a lot of massaging and really trying to get these headliner mechanics just right. The ones that I think you should be a little bit critical of or a little bit wary of are the ones that seem a little half-baked. I put a lot of faith into the Samurai mechanic. I was like, you know what, this looks weird, but I'm sure they did. I'm sure it's balanced enough. They had enough time. Design timelines are tough. Sometimes archetypes get put in at the very end of a set. Sometimes they don't get enough test time. Sometimes they just don't get enough love. Sometimes they overlook something and the deck really, really needed something, right? I don't know if that's exactly where Red White Samurais fell in this set, but it was clear that my faith was misguided. It was clear that I put a little bit too much faith. If you look at the set review, I was like, hyping up some of the Samurai cards. I was like, I think these could work. They ended up, just like a lot of people had kind of predicted, as not working well. Like, I don't even think it was like a structural thing that was really the problem. I think it was mostly each of the individual cards kind of sucked. There was a little bit of structural stuff going on there too, where it's like your aggro deck wants to attack with one thing. That doesn't work so well. But I think a little bit of tweaking on each of the cards could make the set or the cards in the archetype work comparable to the rest of the archetypes. So the big picture takeaway, at least for me here, is I think you should put some faith into the cards that take up most of the set's real estate, right? You look at the sagas, there's 20, 30 sagas. It's going to be really hard for these cards to flop, I think, if they're putting this many of the cards in the set, right? It would be a massive failure if all the sagas were bad. Now, mind you, some are better than others, but that's what's going to happen. The cards that are like, well, there's a pocket of 10 of these cards, and like this archetype looks a little bit weird. Those ones, I think, going forward, I'm going to be a little bit more apprehensive, I think. All right, some thoughts on removal here. One of the big stories of this set was that removal was overrated at the beginning of the format, where it's, the big story from content creators, including myself, was you're probably taking removal spells a little bit too highly, where a lot of people at the beginning of the format ended up with 9 sagas, sometimes 8 sagas. People didn't know sagas were good. And when you face one of those decks, it was like, well, this lethal exploit is not that good when my opponent's casting Besaju's, multiple turns in a row. Like, what am I doing with this small ball removal spell? And I think that kind of threw people for a loop a little bit, where I think the message that got heard, and maybe this is on the fault of content creators, right, was don't take removal spells. And I do take some responsibility, some accountability on that front. where it's not that you don't want interaction spells in your deck anymore. That's not it at all. Twisted Embrace, still a good card. Lethal Exploit, I actually really like that card going later in the set when people weren't getting, a million sagas and I was putting more Iron Apprentices in my deck and such, but that's neither here nor there. But whenever there comes a set where removal is not as good as you might expect, it's just that you're going to shift it down on your priority list just a bit. You're not going to first pick it. You're not going to second pick it. You're not happy with a deck of 10 removal spells. You still want interaction. I think that's almost never going to be not true. I think there's rarely going to come a set. I've never played a set where it's just like, you don't need removal. You still need removal. It's certainly something. And like I saw a thread on Reddit today where there was a pick between like a removal spell. It was like an Intercessor's Arrest and some filler white creature. And the person was like, am I not supposed to take this interaction spell here? I heard removal is bad in this format, right? And that just like breaks my heart as a content creator because I'm like, man, maybe we've led these people astray a little bit. So, I mean, going forward, there's going to be different sets that, for whatever reason, maybe there's a lot of token makers that make 1-for-1 removal bad. Maybe there's a lot of value creatures that make 1-for-1 removal bad, just like they were in this set in Midnight Hunt, right? But it's not a you should never take removal spell. It's just shift them down in your priority list just a little bit. Look for the best of the best. Be picky about the ones you take early. I think a good indicator of a good removal spell, and I've said this before, but I do want to repeat it. If your removal spell provides you some additional value rather than just kill that thing, it's probably a good removal spell. I'm thinking Grim Bounty from AFR, makes a treasure, right? Twisted Embrace kind of has a little bit of that, where it's like, okay, you cast it, you can buy it back from the yard sometimes, you can pick it up with your Geothermal Kami. It's more than just point and click removal spell, right? Anything that generates an additional resource, even if that resource is just life, right? That's a really good resource to tack onto your removal spell. These are the things that I'm looking for in my removal spells I do want to take early. For example, look at Assassin's Ink in this format. The 2 black gets cheaper if you have an artifact or enchantment. That card was fine, right? It wasn't a bad card, but it wasn't one I was excited to take early, and I would take Twisted Embrace above it as well. So the things that are just like, yeah, snap that off, kill that, those are still going to be good, and the cheaper they are, the better they are. But I'm really, really looking for, give me some sort of additional resource. Give me some sort of bonus on my removal spell. Those are the awesome ones, because even if your opponents are casting sagas that give them value, your removal spell gives you value right back. So that's something to look out for sure. My last big picture takeaway from my own thoughts here are that numbers can be misleading if you're looking in the wrong place on 17 lands. And of course, this is the story of Red in this format. The story that early on, a lot of content creators, again, including myself, were pretty down on Red. Just looking at the 17 land numbers as, yeah, these are, the red cards are very much underperforming. If you look at the aggregate data, it looks like even the best looking commons, right? The Kami Flare and the Voltage Surge and the Experimental Synthesizers, these cards are not doing nearly as well as even the medium green commons, for example, right? And again, I've got to give Ben and Ethan of Lords Limited credit. They were on this from day 1, day 2, where what they said, which turned out to be true, is the red cards don't play well with other cards or with other colors, but they play pretty well with each other. And you can get some really, really awesome decks in this format that are mono red, close to mono red, that tussle with the best of the best decks in the format. And that's just not something I would have guessed on week 1 of the format. It's very rare that a color has a complete overhaul, or at least a complete shift in how I view it from day 1 to day 20, 30 or whatever, a few weeks into the format. But that's what happened with Red, though, because, again, if you're just looking at aggregate numbers on 17 lands, you can be very misled. Now, not anything against the numbers. The numbers are never trying to mislead you. They are just numbers, right? But you can definitely misstep in how you're interpreting the numbers. Just to spell it out here, where you really see Red performing well is if you go into 17 lands and you don't look at aggregate data. You sort by each color pair. And each color pair, well, to be fair, each color pair was still not very, very promising if you look at green-red or look at blue-red. But if you look at black-red, hey, the red cards are actually performing pretty well. And if you dive a little bit deeper, search by just mono-red, and this is not a place you often look, mono-colored, you can see, oh wow, these decks are performing actually incredibly well. Patchwork Automaton, Kamano Faces Kakazan, these are 2 cards that if you look at the aggregate data, man, not performing all that well, right? Kamano had if you look even now, it has a 58% win rate, which isn't bad, but it's not stellar. Patchwork Automaton, same place. Shift to mono red, these cards are performing phenomenally. They're like A level cards, B+ level cards, winning at 64% game in hand win rate. So yeah, just another cautionary tale about using 17 lands. Don't just look at aggregate numbers and say, this is true about the format. There's going to be some hidden stuff in there if you're not looking carefully. So going to be something that I'm looking at going forward, and something that I implore you to as well. Okay, so like I said at the top of this podcast, I pulled from some community thoughts here, right? Some Twitter, some Discord thoughts here. So I'm just going to share with you some ideas and some takeaways that people from the community on Twitter and such took from Kamigawa. All right, so I phrased this as, what is something that you learn, or what is something that Kamigawa taught you? And from our first comment here is from Armrick, and Armrick says, learn that unconsciously filing filler under quote-unquote, I never want to pick this, and ignoring how good the cards are based on, what you envision a great version of your deck looking like might hurt you. So what that means, and Armrick's actually in chat, and they can correct me if I misstep here. But I think the point here is saying that in a format with really powerful cards, where the good cards and then the kind of medium filler cards, it's very easy to go, here's a pack of filler cards. I don't really want these filler cards, right? And just maybe taking a bad card instead, or I don't know, maybe just not taking a card that you could envision making your deck, right? I would say Chain Flail Centipede is maybe a good example of this, well, that's not a very good card, but then you look at your pile and go, well, I've actually got a lot of cheap evasive stuff. So this Chain Flail Centipede, while not amazing, is going to be actually okay in my evasive deck, or my deck with a lot of menace, right? This is what I talk about a lot of the time, where it's, you're making the best out of your 22nd, 23rd card when those cards aren't so good. You're playing the best out of the worst cards, right? Where maybe those 20 to 23rd cards aren't cards you're excited about, but in your deck, they actually do pull their weight. And that's something I think you can always look for, right? It's very deflating sometimes to look at a pack and be like, well, there's nothing here, especially later in the format where you're going, oh yeah, people just took all the good cards and now I'm left with, said Chain Flail Centipede. But I do think that this is a good format for kind of identifying, because, this is something that people say all the time. Luis talks about this on LR, where the bad cards in formats these days are not bad cards. They're not unplayables. They're just less good than the other cards in the set, right? So finding those spots where the bad cards are overperformers, I think goes a long way. And this is just building with synergy in mind. This is just building with your deck plan in mind. It's not filing cards into bad buckets and good buckets. It's really looking at what you can do with the medium cards. Next one up here, My Opinions Are My Own, says, this set really drove home the point that removal is overrated. Also, the concept that many different types of mana curves can be viable in the same format. So I touched on the removal aspect. The more interesting part of this comment, I think, is that the concept that many different mana curves can be viable in the same format. And I think this is very true, especially if you're somebody who thinks about sets as slow sets or fast sets or 17 land decks, 17 land decks often, or 18 land decks often in this format. Limited's kind of moved away from that a little bit, right? Where they've done a very, very good job of just seeding each set with a wide variety of archetypes. So it's not like this format demands a curve of all 2-drops or a curve of, all 1-drops necessarily. Some decks do, some decks want that, but it's very archetype to archetype, right? You had these 14 land mono red decks you could get with all the 1s, all the 2s. And then you also had these decks with some defensive good early stuff and then 4 or 5 Imperial Oaths at the top, right? It's very much deck dependent. I would be very cautious about grouping, decks with what you think the format is about, or maybe the opposite, grouping what you think the format is about with how you should build your deck, right? Because it's not like, oh, how do you want to build your deck in Kamigawa? And I can give you a straight answer. It's more, how do you want to build your blue-red deck, or your black-red deck, or your green-white deck? Those all have very, very different answers depending on what your deck wants to do. 2 related tweets here, one from Zoe and one from Chris Farajan, saying that drafting based on archetype strength is more important than drafting on raw power level. And Chris says, for me, it crystallized the importance of understanding the good decks in the format and how to steer towards them. Yeah, I think this is really important. I think this is something that, as sets have kind of become a little bit more mirroring constructed a bit, where it's just like I was talking about, exactly what your deck wants. Exactly what blue-black wants, exactly what red-black wants. It becomes a little more, I don't want to use the term cookie cutter, because I think that's giving a disservice to, how complex Limited is. But I can certainly show you a ideal version of blue-black, and I want exactly these synergy cards and exactly these payoffs, right? And I think as Limited trends a little bit towards that and a little bit away from raw individual card quality mattering and being the end all be all of how good your deck is, right? I would say that lean a little bit more into, hey, blue black's a good deck, I want to get into that, or hey, red black's a good deck, I want to get into that. Less so, oh, I opened this good green card, and so this pushes me down a green path, and maybe I pair green with red, and oh, hey, I'm playing my good green card with some good red cards, but then you realize, oh, my deck's not actually that good because green and red don't play that well together, right? So really think about the big picture, is what I'd say. Really think about how your end deck is going to look, how your end deck is going to function, right? This isn't to say that this hasn't always been the case. It's funny, Dominaria flashbacks were this week. You can actually see the difference, I think, quite dramatically between that set and this set, where, sure, you still wanted to build a deck. It wasn't like you're just throwing cards in your deck and hoping that it worked, right? You're still wanting to build with synergies. But there were, the last 12 cards of your deck, I think, were what I would consider kind of filler cards, and they didn't play in a super important role in your deck a lot of the time. And this isn't to say all the decks in that format. I'm just saying, I'm just generalizing here. But I think every single card in your deck matters a little bit more these days, and it's not just, here are your 5, 6, 7 powerful cards to build around those, and the rest can kind of fill itself out. It really is about knowing what each archetype looks like, I think. Okay, so revisiting the set review. Here are some individual cards that I want to touch on why the community maybe misstepped, why, like I was saying, I misstepped a little bit. Maybe me and Ethan, our conversations got derailed during the set review, why we were led down the wrong path to thinking that cards were better or worse than they actually ended up being. So the first one I want to touch on, it's the story of the set, right? Imperial Oath. Now, I do have to give myself a little bit of credit. I did shout this one out as, I think this card's actually really good, but I didn't give it enough credit it deserved. I think I gave it like a C+ in the set review. It was like a B+, really. This card was just fantastic, right? And for a long time, for the community, this card was quite underrated still. I think it took 2 weeks for this card to really catch on. What was great about this card? I think, number one, it's one card that generates multiple bodies, multiple resources. And that is something that I think people just overlook as a very valuable thing. More material just means you have so many more options, right? I would just argue that 6/6 worth of stats divided across 3 bodies is a lot better than a 6/6, because you can choose, at least on defense, right? On offense, you could argue that a 6/6 is better, but on defense especially, you can be more modular about where you put the power and toughness. You can block 2 here and 1 here, and you can like chump block 3 times, that kind of stuff. But also, like, you can sacrifice a third of the body, right? Or you can augment some of the body and leave another part of the body back to block, and the other part attacks. That wasn't actually as relevant because Vigilance means you could attack and block with this card, which was another very overlooked part of this card. I think Vigilance is a kind of underrated ability. Honestly, when people talk about the best limited abilities, flying, lifelink, Vigilance doesn't come up that often. But in the right spot, in a defensive deck that wants to turn the corner while still being, somewhat defensive shields up, Vigilance is just fantastic, especially on larger creatures, which, mind you, these aren't, but, I'm thinking Harmonious Emergence, the 4/5. You really, really felt the Vigilance on that card. And then, of course, the part that I think was very easy to overlook is Scry 3, right? At that part of the game, turn 6, Scry 3 is just better than draw a card. It really is, right? Because you put 2 lands on the bottom very often. Or you dig, you put 3 cards on the bottom because you're digging into more action, and you top like a 2-drop. You see a 2-drop on top, you're going to put that on the bottom because you just want to dig to more Imperial Oaths. So it was a lot of things about this card that I think people overlooked. Pretty much every single part of this card I think was overlooked. Even the singular mana cost in the corner, right? The single white, that part was overlooked. It's a very splashable card. I don't think people looked at this card as a card they wanted to splash, but clearly, as the set panned out, we figured out, hey, yeah, this is a great card to splash in virtually every deck. So just a little bit of a case study here. I'm sure when this kind of card appears in the future, we're not going to underrate it. We now know that making multiple bodies, even though it's expensive, is very, very good. I would also push to say that these kind of cards, Imperial Oath, Honey Mammoth, Ravenous Lindworm, the 6/6 Wolf from Crimson Vow, they all have overperformed, right? These like stabilizing 6-drops. And that's a bit of a note from me as myself. I'm a person that's biased away from expensive cards. Expensive cards are good if they have high impact. I think that's something that's very important to take in. All right, some of the big misses here. All of the white aggressive cards, Moth Rider Patrol, Hot Shot Mechanic, all the samurai cards. Now, the one I want to focus on, of course, is Moth Rider Patrol. I love me a 1-mana 1/1 flyer, and they duped us. They tricked us. Well, they tricked me. I take this as a personal offense. This was the first time in a while that the 1-mana 1/1 flyer in white was not a good card. Over and over and over again. It was like, this is a good card. You go back to pretty much every set in the past 2 years. The 1-mana 1/1 flyer has always had a spot. Now, I could argue that this is contextual a little bit, because if the the samurai synergies were a little bit better, you cared about the bonuses when this attacked, it got really big, it got attacking bonuses, it lets you cast your creatures out of the graveyard from Heiko and Norica. Those are synergies you wanted to go after. Then, yeah, I think this card would have been a little bit better. But I also just think that, a bigger picture here, the white aggressive cards didn't support the Moth Rider Patrol's plan. It just wasn't really there as a card. You didn't want to put a 1-mana 1/1 flyer in your deck for chip damage, because white cards didn't want chip damage, right? It just wasn't what this set was about, or wasn't what white in this set was about. So I don't really know if there's a takeaway here, to be honest. I think this is very much like something you can't tell before you play the set. It's something that I don't think I would have guessed. I mean, I didn't guess before I played the set that the aggressive cards didn't work the way you wanted them to. But I guess really the takeaway is just that things are contextual. We know that. We all know that. That's not news at all. Based on new context after you play the set a little bit, I guess just be willing to adjust your priors. And that's just good general advice. Again, this isn't anything new. This is more just me wallowing the fact that this 1-mana 1/1 flyer was not as good as I would have liked it to be is all. All right, Farewell. I got to talk about Farewell. So Farewell, I gave a C+ in the set review. With the logic, it's a Wrath. It's a 6-mana Wrath. 6-mana Wraths are, expensive. Wraths in Limited tend to be a little bit awkward sometimes because, often, especially in white where you're playing a lot of creatures, you can kind of screw yourself over a bit. I think that, and Wraths actually have been kind of on kind of this weird trajectory where some of them are really good in some sets lately. Some of them are really bad. If you think back to By Invitation Only from Crimson Vow, the one where you picked, 1 to 13, everybody sacrificed that many creatures. That card was medium. It was good, but it wasn't bomby bomb, not as much as Farewell. I think that the thing that I missed about Farewell, honestly, I think this was a reading comprehension thing, was I didn't realize it said choose one or more. I think I read it as choose one, and choose one would still be pretty good on this card, but the fact that you can make this modular is what makes the difference, right? It's the fact that you can say, kill all your stuff, my stuff stays. If you can turn your Wrath into a Plague Wind, obviously that card's going to be fantastic, right? So I guess if you're evaluating Wraths going forward, really look for the modular Wraths. The easier it is to make it modular, make it do what you want instead of, some Wraths are kind of finicky where it's like, oh, you have to do all this setup and then you get your Plague Wind, you get all your opponent's creatures die, mine survive. The easier it is to do that, the better the card is. And I think that this is also a testament to the fact that, a 6-mana Wrath, you're not going to get the blowout of, oh, I played this on turn 4, and, I didn't play anything until turn 4. My opponent went 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop. I Wrathed them. That's the dream for some of the 4-mana Wraths that have existed in the past. You don't get that with this card, but what you don't get in that instant, oops, I just won the game on the spot on turn 4, you get in, okay, well, I wait a few more turns and I get a better payoff. So this is a point towards saying, just like I was talking about with Imperial Oath, expensive isn't always bad as long as you're getting your money's worth, essentially. Suit Up. Suit Up is one that, just like Imperial Oath, took a while to catch on. So, Suit Up, this is a very simple lesson. Draw a card is great. You tack on draw a card to any mediocre effect, it just raises the ceiling, or raises the floor of that card astronomically. Your card can only be so bad when it says draw a card on it. Now, this is within reason, of course, right? You still has to be a reasonable mana cost. A 6-mana card that says draw a card is a much higher opportunity cost than a 2 or 3-mana card that says it. The cheaper your card that you're tacking on draw a card to, the more it makes it acceptable at any point in the game. I think that the thing that people attach themselves to when looking at this card was much more, oh, I'm looking at the effect. Oh, that's not a very good effect. And missing the, you know what? Even if it's not that good of an effect and it's situational, draw a card makes up a lot for that. Especially, there was some context in here too, where your opponent was often forced to block your cheap creatures in blue in this set. That is something that's not going to happen every single set. Often your opponent's going to be like, all right, take the 2 damage. Like, I that's okay. I don't mind that at all when they attack your 2/2 or their 2/2 into your good 2/2 creature. But in this set, you had to block Virus Beetle. If you didn't block Virus Beetle, you were going to get gotten one way or the other. So this kind of put them in a very damned if they do, damned if they don't situation. And when you did get that, all right, well, I blocked with my 2/2 on your Virus Beetle, you did get a really nice 2-for-1 and Tempo Blowout. So, mind you, like I was saying, this does have some context where this card, if you put it into any set, it's not going to perform as well as I think it did here. But I think that where people assume this card would perform is the floor is much, much higher because that draw card. Also, worth noting, I'm sure there's a few people listening who probably still don't even know this. You can animate vehicles with this card. You can suit up your hover bike or something and it becomes a 4/5. You don't even need to crew it. It does say target creature or vehicle becomes an artifact creature. That's something I think people were learning even like 3-4 weeks into the format. All right, and of course, a Virus Beetle. Gotta touch on this one. Why was this card so good in this set? This simple 2-mana 1/1 in black that makes your opponent discard a card. Well, just like with Suit Up, just like with all these cards I've been talking about, there's a lot of context here. I can't remember the last time this kind of card was this good. In fact, I don't think this card has ever been this good. I think this is the actual best version of this effect we've ever had. And, well, it was a lot of things, right? Ninjas obviously played a huge part. It being a cheap artifact played a huge part. But I think a big thing, too, you could really get into these situations where your opponent was really pressed because they're like, man, I really don't want to discard any of my cards because I need this 6th land. Discarding a land is not trivial here. I need to cast my Imperial Oath, so I have to discard a spell. Or they had, your opponent had Modern Age going, and it's like, well, if I pitch a land here, that's a land I can't loot away to my Modern Age. And there was a lot of looting going on in this set too. Modern Age, Network Terminal, there's a few other things going on in there. So that's another part of it too. Of course, the fact that you could rebuy this a few times with either, Season of Renewal or just picking it up with your ninjas was great. The fact that this paired well with other discard, if you had a lot of Virus Beetles plus a Long Reach of Night, you really put your opponent in a bind. So again, I don't know if we're ever going to see a set where Virus Beetle was as good as it was here, but man, am I going to be on the lookout for it for sure. Experimental Synthesizer. So I actually, again, rated this card pretty highly, at least, relatively to where I think a lot of people rated it early on. I don't have much to say about this card other than the fact that it's really cool. I think it's really cool that it's a pretty unique effect. We've seen this kind of effect on Reckless Impulse and this kind of impulse draw kind of stuff, but we've never seen it on this, like a 1-mana artifact that has an ability in play and also has an ability when it leaves. And there's so many things that you could do with this card. I just kind of want to give a shout out to this card as being very interesting as from a design perspective, very cool to play with. One of the things that Wizards has a bit short on, they just don't have as much design space as they would like, is just new effects or new contextualizations of effects we've seen before, where there's only so many effects that you can have on common. Rares can be pushed to do really strange things, but commons, they kind of have to be tied down to there's complexity issues. There's, we don't want this particular powerful effect at common. And I think the fact that there's still room for cards like this, it just really, really gets me excited. I'm really happy that these kind of cards exist. And if there are more cards going forward that make me go, I've never seen a card like this. How the hell do I evaluate that? I'll be very, very happy. So just shout out to Experiment with the Synthesizer. Tamiyo Safekeeping. This was one that very opposite actually of Experimental Synthesizer, where it was like, okay, Tamiyo Safekeeping is actually an effect we've seen before with Snakeskin Veil and Blossoming Defense, these 1-mana green tricks to give something hexproof. But for whatever reason, I myself and other people kind of just didn't make that analog. I mean, I'm sure some people did. They said, oh, this is just Snakeskin Veil with a bit of a different rider on it. You don't get a counter, you gain 2 life. But those cards were pretty good in their formats. Snakeskin Veil was pretty good. Blossoming Defense was very good in Kaladesh. This card is, it was a surprise to a lot of people that it was kind of creeping up the ranks as the days went on when 17 Lands Data was coming out. But by the end of the format, this is one of Green's top performing commons. Now, one of the things that contributed to that is, again, a context thing where often with these cards, these green protection cards, the play pattern is hold my expensive good card until one turn after when I could usually cast it. You cast your 6/6 on turn 7, so on turn If you cast it on turn 6, it's vulnerable to removal spell, but if you cast it on turn 7 with the green mana up, you get to keep your 6/6, and even if they go for the removal spell, it's a giant blowout for them. With this card, it was even better, because the stuff you wanted to protect often just apparated out of thin air, right? There were sagas. So what would happen is you play Boseiju on turn 4, you let that go for a few turns, and on turn 6, your opponent casts a removal spell on it, and you had mana just going like, oh, I don't need to wait for my casting my giant thing that I want to protect. It's just I have that untapped mana already, which is awesome, right? I think that the other thing that contributed here is the 2 life. The 2 life, I think, is better than a counter. The fact that this also gave Indestructible could help win in a combat, that was good too, where Snakes and Veil just gave hexproof. But there was a lot of times where my opponent, went for lethal, and the 2 life was the thing that saved me. So it's a lot of little things on this card that added up to something great, but I'm going to be looking out for the variants of this card in the future and seeing, what they have to bring to us. And I think this is just the best version of this effect we've seen. Bamboo Grove Archer. This is one that I got a lot of questions about early on in the set review cycle, where it's like, oh, I think this card is better than I thought. And a lot of people came to me and said, I think this card is better than I thought. And I was like, I don't know. It's kind of mopey. Even in your mid-range decks, do you really want this defender that doesn't do that much? And it turned out that the mid-range decks in this format were going so far over the top, casting these sagas, casting again Imperial Oath, that they just wanted defensive speed. They just wanted to not die. And that's what this card did perfectly. So I think the takeaway here is that if your top end is awesome, you just want as much defense as you possibly can. And there were decks where I didn't want this card, like green-black mid-range decks, where my top end wasn't awesome, and I couldn't afford to have just this 3-mana 3/3 defender that just played defense, where I didn't have the Imperial Oaths, I didn't have the over-the-top sagas or rares, right? Fade into Antiquity. This is another one that I poo-pooed a little bit in the set review, because the previous enchantment and artifact sets had changes to be like, you know what, you have targets for this, but even if you have targets, you have to have a good target. And while I think that's true, the thing that was different about Neon Dynasty is that there was just a lot of good targets. This is the highest density of artifacts and enchantments we've seen out of any set ever, right? Most sets in the past that have had this kind of card were just artifact sets or just enchantment sets, Theros, Mirrodin, those kind of things. And these kind of cards remain deckable in those formats, but they weren't awesome. They were good, but not, a card you wanted 2 copies of, 3 copies of sometimes. Fade into Antiquity just had enough targets where it was much better than it would have been in Theros. We saw it in original Theros, actually, or one of those artifact heavy sets, because it's just numbers. It really is just numbers. There's just so many more targets, and that's just something I didn't take in. I just shortcutted to, these haven't been good in the past. That's probably not going to be good enough here. When, hey, I probably should have just done a little bit more research and looked pre-set review and gone, hey, there's actually 70% of the set that this card hits. So, just a little bit of just a little bit of a heads up for me. Run some more numbers, I guess, beforehand. Network Terminal. Network Terminal is a card or a type of card that I kind of warn against sometimes, or not warn against, but a card that, Manalith, these 3-mana mana rock cards, where if you're looking to fix, they're a little bit clunky. I think just like a Windrake, or just like a 2-mana 2/2, or just like a 5-mana 3/3 flyer, all these cards that are not awesome in modern day limited, where they've kind of just been power crept a little bit, you add a little bit to those cards, and they become pretty good cards often. With a 2-mana 2/2, you give it prowess, or you make it come along with a 1/1, or a 5-mana 5/5 flyer, or 5-mana 3/3 flyer. You make it tap something down on ETB. Same thing's happening here with Network Terminal, where yes, Manalith is still not an awesome effect, but man, did that looting ability really put it over the edge to be an actual good engine card in the late game. Fixes you early and then filters you in the late game. It's really what these decks wanted to push through, so they didn't flood. So I'm going to be on the lookout. Again, I'm going to be on the lookout for Manaliths that do something, right? Somebody points out in the chat, Bart points out, we also had a Goodwin Strixhaven, where maybe I should have known that, because Letter of Acceptance was a good card, right? It's the same as a Manalith that sacrifices to draw a card. This is kind of doing what Letter of Acceptance was doing, right? So yeah, just goes to show, again, do a little bit of a tweak on a card, and it can be better than any other version of the card you've seen, even if those other versions are not super amazing. And then I want to talk about the lands just quickly. The Takenuma, Sukenzin, Aganjo, these kind of cards, where I think we kind of learned through this set, or at least, people adjusted, that while they are awesome to be able to put it in your land slot, no opportunity cost for putting it in your deck, there is an opportunity cost to actually drafting it. Because often you'd be forced to make the choice between, do I take one of these value lands that, it's essentially free in my deck, right? I can just replace the swamp and it's free rolling it. But I'm going to have to take it over a pretty good card, like pretty good spell. And especially because these are, constructed level rares. People often, I think, take these cards a little bit higher than I would. You don't see them, 9th pick very often. I mean, you'd be lucky if you did, but it'd be a good place to take them there. But you'd have to take them in the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 picks of the draft. And that's often not something you wanted, right? Beseiju, I think, was a bit of an exception. That one was awesome. That was just Doomblade. I mean, Doomblade on a land with, minor downside. But the other 4, I think, were real cost-benefit analyses for you in the draft. You're like, oh, wait, well, am I going to take this Twisted Embrace, or am I going to take this land? Am I going to take this ninja, this good ninja, or good ninja enabler, or am I going to take this Takenuma, right? And I think that as we move a little bit towards all of your spells are awesome, or you also don't need to get as much incremental value out of every little nook and cranny of your draft deck. Your cards, your spells kind of just give you a bunch of value. It's a little bit interesting to weigh these lands, where I think in the past it used to be like, yeah, value lands are awesome because they get, you get to edge out incremental value, but you're making a big, or a reasonable, substantial pick when you're actually taking them over a good spell, is what I would say. And then last one here I have is Eater of Virtue. So this is the equipment, the rare equipment, that gives +2 and then, picks up a bunch of ability words when things die. This one was very interesting. It was kind of a case study in knowing what your deck wants, because, I saw a lot of this card being played in green mid-range decks where, honestly, +2 to one of your cheap creatures is not that impactful. It's just not what your decks with Beseiju and a bunch of expensive rares are looking for. It's just not worth the card as much as it would be in a deck with a bunch of cheap flyers or a bunch of token makers or a bunch of red aggressive creatures, right? Where I think a lot of people look at this card as like, ooh, this is Bone Splitter, and Bone Splitter is awesome. I mean, I said that myself, right? And it just turned out that not every deck wants a Bone Splitter. And maybe that's kind of obvious in retrospect, right? Just looking at what your deck actually wants. That's the theme of I've been talking about today. But I think as the format went on, people noted this card is not the awesome first pick I think that a lot of people might have made it out to be. Also, the small note of, hey, this card actually hurts you a little bit because exiling your creatures is a bit of a cost, because you're like, oh, I kind of wanted to buy those back with my Season of Renewal, my turtle. I don't actually want these cards exiled. Also, the fact that they didn't pick up keywords from sagas, that actually mattered a bit, because, you have maybe 7 real creatures in your deck, and some of those have keywords, but the rest are sagas. So it's like half the value of this card, being a keyword moving around machine, actually gets kind of nullified in those decks with not a lot of real creatures. All right, and that's it. That's all I got to say about the lessons learned from Kamigawa. Chat, if you have any cards you'd like to talk about as we wrap up here, any questions you have about this set, some of you want to share your own experiences, I'd love to hear them. Some thoughts going forward into the next set. Let me have them. Let me hear them, and we'll have a little bit of a chat. Feelings on the 2/1 construct. This is Containment Construct. Yeah. So I think this card got hyped up a little bit at the beginning of the format, like a little bit too much, where people were like taking it early and then trying to build it around it, where they were just like, take Sky Swimmer Koi because they had, Containment Construct, or, take just like not great cards to try to make their construct work, or just take it too early when, the payoff of that card being good in your deck when you have a lot of looting is good, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like a take it kind of build around it card. I loved the card when I already had a bunch of Modern Ages and some network terminals. Thought it was fantastic, right? Just being able to like accrue a bunch of value. Even just one card's worth of value was quite good. You play an additional land off the card for free and then they have to kill it. Really, I like that. But I feel like I always had to temper people to be like, in my drafts on stream, people were like, oh, don't you want to take Containment Construct? Here, and it was like pick 1, pack 2 or something. Pack 1, pick 2. And like, no, it's kind of a card I want to take later. Or I'd first pick a Modern Age, and there'd be a Twisted Embrace or another good card in the pack. And, chat would be like, oh, it must be, that can't be right to not take the Containment Construct there when you already got the Modern Age. But, yeah, I like the card. I think people overrated it just a little bit. The common dual lands made 3 colors easy this round. You think Streets of New Capenna will be similar for drafting multicolored? Yeah, for sure. I mean, they already showed us a little bit where at common they're gonna have it's like an Evolving Wilds variant that can only go and get 3 colors, right? So for whatever deck you're in, which is cool. It means that not all of the decks are going to be multicolored soup decks, which is actually the goal. I don't think there's going to be dual lands at common. Might be wrong here, but I don't think there's going to be like the kind of dual lands we saw in Kamigawa, because often in these kind of sets, they want you to push towards 3 colors, not 4 and 5. Now, those 4 and 5 color decks can exist, certainly, but they would prefer the people in Grixis or Maestros, whatever it's called, to get the cards for them and not just have 4 multicolor, 5 color drafters having all of the great cards because they picked up all the fixing early. So it's actually kind of funny. We might end up with less good fixing or fewer good fixing tools in Streets of New Capenna than we did in this set. I'm going to be curious to see where that lies. Oh, chat says there have been allied colored duels. Yes, that makes sense. I forgot about those. I don't think we'll have enemy colored duels. I think they will want to avoid people trying to draft like, Obzon or Mardu, right? And enemy colored duels encourage that. What are your thoughts on the recovery vehicle? Oh, Imperial Recovery Unit? That's a great one. So that's another one that falls into the kind of chain flail centipede-ish category for me, where I don't think it was a good card, but I definitely had decks where I went, I can actually make use of this because I've got double Spirited Companion and a Virus Beetle and a lot of pretty good value-y creatures to buy back, and it would definitely be better than a Nezumi Blade Buster kind of filler type card, where synergy just barely edges out it being, the synergy, what's the best way to put this? The synergy that card provides to your deck does, make it a better card than some random filler card, but that would be kind of a specific situation, right? It would really make me look at my deck and go, is this a Imperial Recovery Unit deck? Because if it wasn't, if I had one Spirited Companion, and I was like, well, I hope you recur this one Spirited Companion, I was probably in for a bad time. That's cards, I think, that's the kind of card you want to not just put in your deck hoping it's going to be good. you want to put it in your deck being I know I have enough cards to make this good. But when you do have enough cards to make it good, it's going to be good. And that's the type of card that I think you're going to see underperform if you're just looking at 17 land stats, because not every deck is going to be good for that card. Not every deck is going to have 2 Spirited Companions, 2 Virus Beetles. It would be interesting, if Sirkovitz or, one of the data people over at 17 lands could do a comparison of how good does that card get once you have, with 2 Spirited Companions, 3 Spirited Companions, 4. Because I imagine it would actually be quite a well-performing card when you get to that upper echelon of good cards that play well with it. Why was Norica so much better than Heiko considering how similar they were? Because a 3-mana 3/2 has better prospects of attacking profitably than a 4-mana 3/3. I think is what it comes down to. Also, the decks that wanted Heiko were just rarer, because decks that had artifact synergies were more interested in just ending the game quickly than grinding out value. Clawing Torment and Iron Apprentice are the 2 most improved cards. Yes, I actually should have shouted those 2 out, actually. So Clawing Torment is one that I don't even think it took that long for people to realize that that was actually a good card, right? But in your ninja decks and your black-red decks, that card was fantastic because it's better than just kill your opponent's creature a lot of the time. There was risk, right, in your opponent picking it up with a ninja, picking the creature you enchanted up with a ninja. But if it stuck around in your decks that were just, looking to attack, get your opponent's creatures dead, putting that aura on your opponent's creature and draining them a bit was just better than straight up killing your opponent's creature, which is really, really awesome. I think it's cool that black kind of got this pseudo plus Swords to Plowshare-esque effect that only aggressive decks could use to the best of its effect, right? So yeah, that was a big gainer. Also, Iron Apprentice definitely got a shout out that card as especially as I started my red phase of the format where I was drafting more and more red decks. I wish there was actually more cards like Iron Apprentice in the set that came in with a counter. I think that would solve a lot of the modified decks problems, where often what happened with your modified payoffs is you had to both like work to get the modified payoffs into play and work to get your creatures modified. Where if you just had some more like incidental stuff like Iron Apprentice, maybe a 2-mana 2/2 that came in with some counters, or like an Iron Shell Beetle even, just like a 2-mana 1/1 puts a counter on something. I think that probably makes those synergies a bit more approachable, because as I drafted these aggressive red decks, like Iron Apprentice, I realized like if I just have a bunch of those, I can play Ambitious Assault, like the +2 draw a card very comfortably. I can play the Samurai, the 1/3 Samurai that gets +2/+0 for each modified creature. That card becomes actually good in my deck. So I wish actually there was just a little bit more of that so that the modified cards could shine a bit. And yeah, I love that card in the later stages of the format when I was drafting the red decks. Yeah, for sure. What card did I hate to see the most? Oh, it had to be like one of the 2-3 mana sagas, the Kiki-Jiki Saga or the Jugen Defensive Temple. Like, those cards are so brutal to play against because you needed just like more than one removal spell to deal with them. And even if you had 2 removal spells, they still likely got some amount of value from them, right? And you needed pretty specific removal spells too. It couldn't like, you especially with the Jugen one, you needed to exile it before it flipped. Like at least with the Kiki-Jiki one, you had a turn where it was just sitting there or didn't have haste. But if you let the Jugen Saga flip, they had a turn where they could just make like a 7/7 or whatever from their 2-mana card. So yeah, that one was really rough, and you're always in for an uphill battle after that. After the numbers pod, which is referring to the numbers pod with Sirkovitz, I did a podcast with Sirkovitz where he looked at my data and dissected it and talked about my tendencies, which was really cool. Go check that out if you're interested in that. How are you feeling about your review process, and any thoughts on a subsequent review deeper into the format? Yeah, so, I mean, it's always funny, Beard Witch, because my thought, I'm talking here about things that I wish I did better in the set review, or like I should have maybe caught a little bit earlier. I think that that it's almost more for me than for the audience in a way, because I don't think the audience actually cares, at least my impression is, I don't think the majority of the audience actually cares that you're exactly accurate about everything. I think most people take set reviews as a way to learn the set, right? That's their main function, at least in my eyes as a content creator. And yeah, they'd like you to be correct a lot of the time. And not to say I'm not going to be striving for correctness and being the most accurate as I can be. I think people also come for cool takes and things that they didn't see. That there's also some value in that too. I almost wish that we can move away from grades. Like, we've had this conversation before, right? With we actually, we tried the 4R system. Didn't really work that well. People are very accustomed to grades at this point. I wish it was much more a kind of just conversation about the cards, less a here's how Caillou, because like in translation, it never pans out as you're gonna take the set review as what you're doing for even past day 3-4 of the format, right? So grades wear off very, very quickly. So it's like the main point of grades is kind of as a anchoring mechanism so people you can kind of put a stamp on the card and be like, yeah, it's about that. Give you an idea of what the conversation boiled down to, right? I think that is very helpful. And so maybe I don't want to actually move away from grades. I guess I wish that people would maybe not put so much weight on needing to have a super accurate grade on day one, because I don't think they matter that much. Is all my feeling is. I think the way Sam Black put it is like, it doesn't make any sense to do a set review before the set comes out, and that's why he does his set review after the sets come out, which I think is it's so great. I mean, like I said, I think they serve a bit of a different function. And if you're looking for a follow-up to the set review, I mean, Sam Black does his own set reviews where he goes through 17 lands, talks about stuff after a few weeks after the set comes out. As far as what my follow-up and maybe something I would do differently, I mean, a set re-review is something I've done in the past, and maybe that's a good just little piece of content and just a very clean, here are the 10-20 cards that we got the most wrong. Usually I frame that in the state of the format address, or like the 2 weeks after the set comes out, the kind of developing stages of the format. I have a little section in one of the podcasts, but maybe that could be its own piece of content. I agree, that would be cool. Yeah. All right, everybody, let's pack up. Thank you so much for closing out Kamigawa with me. It's been a blast. As always, this will be on the YouTube and the podcast feed later tonight. Thank you, Twitch chat, for hanging out with me. Really appreciate it, and hope you all enjoyed Neo. I really enjoyed the set. I know that it's kind of funny. It started as, as most sets do these days, in conversation as, oh, it's an all-timer, and I think people, for various reasons, have come down on it since. But I'm curious to see, looking, a few weeks, after new Capenna has come out, what I think about the set. Because looking back at Crimson Vow, I was like, man, even Midnight Hunt, actually, I don't actually look upon those sets too fondly, even though at the time I liked them quite a bit. So it's interesting to see where this set's gonna lie. And yeah, thank you all for so much for hanging out. We'll see you next time on the next episode of Limited Level Ups. Next episode, I believe, will be the set review with Ethan, Lord Tupperware. That's coming around the 18th of April. So next Monday, I would say. So yeah, check it out. And we'll see you all next time.